what will happen next is the President of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, will most likely ask Benjamin Netanyahu to form the next government, and his consideration is that if he decides to do that, is that Netanyahu is in the most likely position to be able to do that because he has his partners in the coalition made the threshold, and it looks on the basis of arithmetics that he has a clear lead over the opposition, Kahol Lavan. If Netanyahu does indeed win the elections, he will become the longest-serving Israeli prime minister since David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Israel. And I think it's significant that he defeated a political party that was made up of 3 former chiefs of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, who ran on a security ticket and who avoided saying anything controversial on the Palestine issue, and yet Netanyahu still was able to win. So for me, this appears to demonstrate that security, or at least the army, the military in Israeli life, is perhaps not as important as other issues like religion and settlement in the West Bank. So Likud and Kahol Lavan were more or less neck and neck, but it was the other parties, the Orthodox parties, who refused to join a coalition with Kahol Lavan because that coalition includes a political party that wants to draft ultra-Orthodox Jews into the military. In addition, there are other smaller right-wing parties, and this brings me to answer your question about Israeli democracy, because one of those parties has links with a proscribed group, the KAK movement, proscribed in Israel and in the United States, and which calls, for the removal of Arabs from Israel, and this has created or widened, shall I say, the chasm between some Israelis and American Jews who are more liberal. And we saw very strong statements coming out of the American Jewish Committee and even AIPAC when they heard about this new alliance between Netanyahu and this political party. In addition, Netanyahu is facing multiple corruption indictments, and in full knowledge of this, his party has emerged as one of the biggest in the Knesset. Netanyahu also made speeches saying that Israel was a state only for the Jewish people. As you might recall, he passed the Jewish nation state law last year, which was very controversial. And we mustn't forget that 20% of Israelis are Arabs, Arabic speakers, Muslims and Christians, including the Druze community, although very small, just over 100,000, serve in the Israeli army and felt very aggrieved at this law. So Netanyahu's victory does raise questions about whether we can still view Israel as a democracy, not to mention the fact that, and it was hardly raised at all in the elections, that Israel rules over another 4.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and also East Jerusalem, who do not participate in Israeli elections. Good question. So on Saturday, Netanyahu gave an interview to an Israeli TV station, and he said that he was prepared to extend Israeli law not just to the big settlement blocks around Jerusalem, but also to some of the smaller, isolated Israeli settlements deep in the West Bank. Most commentators have dismissed this as election talk, as hot air, as something that he will not do. And they've pointed out that in the last 4 years, he has refused to adopt various proposals, legislative proposals, that would purport to extend Israeli sovereignty over the settlements. And on the basis of his past performance, the claim is, well, he won't do this again. But I think it's different this time. Firstly, he's come out and said this openly on television before an election, He now appears to have won that election. On the basis of that pledge, he will have to form a coalition government with parties that desire, although they are very small, they're very extreme, that desire to extend Israeli sovereignty. We shouldn't forget that the Likud party has consistently, its raison d'etre is that Israel is sovereign between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. That's always been a fundamental tenet of the Likud party's vision for the region. So given what he said, given his coalition, given that he's also facing multiple indictments on corruption, one could envisage that it's not beyond possibility that in exchange perhaps for getting assistance with or getting legislation giving him immunity, shall we say, with regard to these current charges, that in exchange these parties will want something in exchange, and that might very well be annexing some of the West Bank settlements. And of course, the way to do this, it would have dramatic repercussions for the Palestinians, again, who are conspicuously absent from all of the pre-election debates. Even Kahol Levan couldn't come around to saying that they were prepared to acknowledge the establishment of a Palestinian state. They also insisted on a united Jerusalem and retaining security control over the Jordan Valley. Anyhow, they haven't won, and Netanyahu has won, and he's won on a campaign to extend Israeli legislation to the West Bank. So we wait to see what happens, but I would imagine there would be a much more vociferous and vocal reaction, at the very least, to any extension of Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank from the Arab community, from the Palestinians, of course, but also from other countries, such as in Europe, who are, of course, one of the chief financial brokers and supporters of the peace process. And yet, we have seen with President Trump and Vladimir Putin a very muted reaction to the annexation, to the United States' decision to recognize the annexation of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. And although Russia condemned formally the annexation of the Golan Heights, we must remember that they have also annexed territory in the Crimea. So I would take whatever President Putin says was a pinch of salt. And his invitation to Netanyahu to go to Moscow before the election can only be seen as an endorsement of his views and his policies. There have always been Israeli parties that have a more moderate stance. You have Meretz, for instance. You have the Labour Party, which, although it's moved further to the centre, you have the Arab parties, of course. They're actually not insignificant. I mean, according to the polls, I think they may take 9, even 10 seats. But they're not seen as it's not seen as kosher for Jewish parties to partner up with the Arab parties. So yes, of course, there's always been voices, even from the centre-right. There's always, and Netanyahu has a lot of critics in Israel. Israel has a great free media that is very critical of his views and his policies, also at the universities, also amongst diaspora Jews. But at the end of the day, he appears to have won it again. And that's what matters in politics. I mean, these statistics about poverty rates, I mean, where are we, which are we looking at the country as a whole, then most of the poorer areas tend to be either the Arab areas or some of the ultra-Orthodox areas. Otherwise, I think Israel's economy has actually been doing quite well under Netanyahu. Those who are wealthy have become wealthier, like most of other countries in the United States and Europe. As for security, well, he doesn't appear to have done too bad in that regard. He's kept Gaza quiet. The Palestinians in the West Bank are also been very quiet. He's made inroads, if you believe press reports, with the some of the Arab countries, some of the Gulf countries, although I'm always suspicious of any broader claims because these issues are not what cannot be discussed in Israel due to censorship. But we know that the rumors are out there and that there have been meetings. So on security, people trust Netanyahu, and the fact that Iran appeared to have either run neck and neck or beaten another party that contained 3 former IDF chiefs of staff seems to show that security wasn't enough to unseat him this time. It's very hard to prosecute an incumbent leader. He can claim immunity, and if not, I'm not familiar with Israeli domestic law. He can probably get his partners to change the law so that is the case. With regard to the allegations, I mean, they're actually quite serious. But Netanyahu skillfully, in some ways, like Trump, was able to portray it as a left-wing conspiracy, as his enemies out to get him, as a media establishment all ganging up against him, and that appears to, again, have resonated with voters. Well, people say lots of things during elections. I suppose your question is perhaps connected to this much vaunted peace deal that President Trump is supposed to present. And again, it's very difficult to comment on something we haven't seen. And it's also questionable whether Netanyahu will even accept it, unless, of course, it meets all his requirements, which we don't know yet. So again, we have to wait and see what the plan contains. As for Netanyahu's relationship with the Palestinians, it's very poor. It has always been very poor, and it will continue to remain poor. The peace process, I don't see it going anywhere, really. Again, it depends on what Trump's peace plan actually entails. I mean, the Palestinians have their own internal problems within Fatah. Was a possible transition in leadership. There's a division between Gaza and the West Bank in terms of not just geography, but also different political movements. The Arab world themselves are divided, and Netanyahu doesn't fundamentally, as I think it's clear, believe in 2 states. So I don't see where this peace plan will go. But again, I have to see what it says. But I know that the Palestinians don't trust Netanyahu and have not trusted him. He's been in power for the last 10 years. They've been for the last 3 or 4 years. There's been no movement on the peace process, and even when there was lots of prevarication from the Palestinian perspective, from the Israeli side, and there was just no meeting of minds on any of the core issues. If the peace proposal envisages Palestinian sovereignty over all of the West Bank, except perhaps a few of the settlements in Jerusalem, Palestinian negotiators in the past have said that would be acceptable, but there's been a hardening of positions because Netanyahu is now indicating that doesn't even meet his minimum. He wants beyond the settlements around Jerusalem. He wants settlements further in the West Bank, and also from a Palestinian perspective, having an independent state is meaningless without having access to Jerusalem. And so the ring of settlements that have been built around Jerusalem, if they're complete, could prevent the ability of Palestinians to have that access, or to at least have territorial contiguity between Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and other parts of the West Bank. In addition, there's also no agreement on what to do with the Jordan Valley, and the issue of who maintains security control, overall security control, is also not resolved. The Israelis are refusing to accept any return of Palestinian refugees. So there isn't really much left of the peace process, and so I think the Palestinians are just going to hunker down and just stay where they are, it seems. There are some who say that the leadership should perhaps once and for all do away with the pretense of a 2-state solution and adopt, say, a BDS-style approach a call for one man, one vote. But of course the question is, what would that change? And it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you call for one man, one vote, an equal rights struggle, that anything will actually change on the ground. As Saib Erekat used to always say, we already live in a one-state reality. We don't have the vote, and nothing's changed. And a one-state system, in his view, would not work, because even if they were given the vote, how would you ever reach agreement in a parliamentary system with such diverse, different views? And anyhow, those who call for the annexation of parts of the West Bank do not envisage giving the majority of Palestinians voting rights or citizenship. And one of the reasons why annexation is being increasingly spoken about in Israel is because the vast majority of what they call Area C, which is just over 60% of the West Bank, now has more Israelis living in it than Palestinians. In which case, even if they were to give the Palestinians their citizenship rights, it wouldn't really matter, because there are more Jews than Palestinians in those areas. So yeah, it's more bad news for the Palestinians, and it might force the Palestinians to have some even more soul-searching, but also it raises difficult questions for those countries that have continued to support and sustain the idea of two states, especially in Europe. So we wait to see what happens. I mean, everyone in Israel serves in the army and does reserve duty, and the army has always been, or the military, I should say, has always been a bastion. And it still remains the case in Israel today. At the same time, you have a growing Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox community who do not serve in the military and who do not want to serve in the military. And in addition, you have further right-wing parties, so nationalist parties who do serve in the military. I think all I'm saying is that if it is the case that Netanyahu emerges victorious and defeats 3 former chiefs of staff of the Israel Defense Force, it would appear to indicate to me that although security, of course, is important and the institution of the military is still important, there's something else that people think is just as important, and it seems to me that is religion, Jerusalem, and the land of Judea and Samaria, if you like. And that seems to me to be a shift that's been taking place for many years, but it's becoming more dramatic now.